Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm Andy McGregor, I'm Deputy Chief Innovation Officer at Jisc, and I'd like to welcome you to our panel session called A Look Over the Horizon. The aim of this session is to talk about how emerging technologies might be used to address the major strategic challenges facing education. It's based around a new report Jisc released this morning called the Horizons Report. Because it came out this morning, none of you have had a chance to read it or know what it is. So I will, before we start the panel session, I'll give you some brief background into what it is and how we produced it and what it's aimed at. But before we do that, I just want to introduce the panelists who are sat here with me today, who come to talk about how emerging technologies may help with education. So over here we have Nick Brazil, Deputy Principal of Gower College in Swansea. Next to me we have Rachel Hall, who is Universities Editor at Guardian. We have Sarah Davies, recently escaped from Jisc to a role as Director of Education and Innovation at Bristol. And we have Gwyneth Swetman, who is President of NUS Wales. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. Before we hear from the panellists, I will just briefly talk about the Horizons Report. So as many of you know, Jisc does research and development to develop new products for members. As part of that process, it's important to us to make sure we're developing things that fit the needs of the sector. So what we've done is we've convened this group called the Horizons Group. It's a very diverse group of sector experts who meet every 6 months. And the group has 2 aims. The first aim is to discuss emerging technologies, specifically the ones associated with the 4th Industrial Revolution, such as AI, robotics, etc., and see which ones are most relevant to education and which ones could help address the major strategic challenges. And out of that discussion, identify opportunities for Jisc research and development projects, which we can work through a process called co-design labs, and eventually turn into products for Jisc members and services. Jisc members, sorry. The first point about discussing those emerging technologies, we felt the discussions were too rich and interesting just to keep within the Horizons group, so we thought it was important to share that information with the wider sector because it gives you a good overview of the challenges we're facing as a sector and a good overview of which technologies offer the most promise. So after every Horizons group meets, we will produce a Horizons report which summarises that discussion. It is aimed as a primer to these challenging topics and an aid to people developing institutional strategies on which technologies they should be focusing on. The first report is released today. It went up this morning, and we've got the URL there, which you can follow and have a look at the report while we have the panel session, if you like. There is a full report. It's 48 pages. It's a lengthy report. You're not going to be able to skim read that during the session. So there is also an infographic, which just details an overview of which technologies offer the most promise to the strategic challenges the report discusses. I will leave it on this slide, so you can look at the report as we go. But before we do that, I just want to briefly explain what's in the report. So the report covers 3 things, and we'll structure the panel discussion around these 3 things. The first is an overview of all the major challenges facing the education research. We summarise that into about 10 of the most important, the Horizons Group believe to be the most important challenges. The next is an analysis of the emerging technologies. Which ones are ready to use now, which ones are maybe more for the future, and which ones offer the most promise in helping with those strategic challenges. And finally, in each Horizons report, we will take an in-depth look at one of the challenges or technologies which are particularly relevant right now and have a look at how it might develop in the future. For this report, we've chosen a very important challenge of mental health, and particularly mental health and well-being and how that's affecting the education sector, specifically universities and colleges. It has a look at gives you an overview of the challenge, makes some predictions for how it might develop in the future, and makes some suggestions for actions we may want to take to address the challenge. So we'll structure the panel discussion around those areas. We will make it interactive, so we'll give you opportunities to ask questions. We'll do that the old-fashioned way, through hands up and roving mics, but we've also got the Me Too platform, so your questions will appear up here, and we'll refer to them as they go. If you want to submit questions that way, go to web.metoo.com and enter a meeting ID, which you can see up there, 135677540, and you can submit your questions. Some of you have already got a handle on it and start to ask questions, so we'll come back and address some of those in a while. And believe me, I'm aware of the irony of talking about emerging technologies while using a clipboard to structure the discussion, but that's going to be the most useful way to do this. We'll start with a softball question for the panellists. We've heard a lot of talk at DigiFest over the last 2 days about 4th Industrial Revolution technologies and whether they'll have an impact, whether they'll bring about Education 4.0. The Horizon report is on the same topic. So, before we start with the panellists, I just want to get a sense of people in the audience. Hands up if you think the fourth industrial revolution technologies are a game changer for education. Okay. And hands up if you think they're just hype. Okay, so we're more in the audience, more in the game changer. Panellists, starting with Gwyneth, game changer or hype?
So I always like to be really, I like to pause and reflect on these kinds of things, but I think this is genuinely one of those situations where this is going to completely change the face of education and research, and I think in a really positive way. I think the UK has an opportunity now to kind of catch up with like the rest of the world on this and really make sure this is at the forefront of what we're doing. I think it's an answer to a lot of the problems we have. And I think also that it's going to be meeting a lot of student expectations. I think the new generations of students going to universities are going to expect things to be more streamlined, and they're going to expect more support. And I think this kind of revolution of technology is really going to help meet those expectations. So I think it's a really good thing, and I enjoy the hype.
Great. Sarah?
I feel really bad now, so... I think it's both. I think it has the potential to change some games in some spaces, and I also think there's a big helping of hype in it as well. I think potentially one of the really key bits is a bit that perhaps doesn't get considered as much, which is how lifelong learning works. I think we kind of go for, education 4.0, universities, let's have a look at what you're doing now and how that might be different. But what about how the whole flow of people through their lives and getting the skills they need, and what impact that has on whether we accredit learning and how we accredit learning and how we support people learning at the same time as whatever else they're doing. But there's such big conservative pressures in society around going to university, going to college, having that transformational experience, and a genuine human need for transformational experiences, that I think that will act as a brake on some of the potentials. But I think it prompts a really interesting question about what the role in society is of universities and colleges, what key human skills are going to be needed no matter what the technology does, what stays as the purview of humans, and then that is a nice frame to come back and reconsider, so how do you engender those skills in people? A kind of fresh lens on how do you teach, how do you best teach.
Interesting, thanks. Rachel?
I think I would agree with everyone so far that it is a blend of game changer and hype. Definitely there is a lot of hype, particularly in the press releases that I receive almost every day from edtech companies. But at the same time, I think, this isn't necessarily going to be this total paradigm shift, because there's a lot of the way universities are structured that there are, as we've talked already, this important transformative experience that you need face-to-face learning for. So, I don't think it's suddenly like we're all going to be going to university on VR headsets or anything, but it's, the kind of better ways of doing some things that happen already, and also good ways of meeting the needs of what are becoming increasingly large institutions where that sort of personal contact isn't quite so easy to have. So, just being able to kind of have sort of AI chatbots as your first point of contact in order to refer, to answer those initial questions, or refer you to somebody and kind of check up on people. So I think it's a good way of managing those larger classroom sizes and the larger institutions that universities are becoming.
Great. Nick?
I think reality of colleges, universities, education kind of provider is that we're there for a specific reason. A specific reason is to, hopefully everybody agrees with this, educate, train people to ultimately be productive in the workforce. As colleges and universities, we are being challenged all the time that we should be doing more. We should be doing more to develop the skills that are needed for now and for the future. And anybody who's been out to employers now will certainly tell you that they are saying digital skills are required. That, sometimes they're saying 2 or 3 years ago that the development is very, very, very quick now. And some employers a few years ago would certainly not be saying what they need now and what they need for the future in terms of digital skills. So we have to respond. There's no doubt there's a challenge, and obviously with the fourth industrial revolution, yes, there is some hype, which you'd expect when there's commercial products in place. People will try to hype it up, obviously, that's the whole idea of commercial products, to get you to buy stuff you don't always need. But reality is things are changing fast, and when you see these reports coming out, and some of it, I suppose, is hyped up again in terms of is this country getting behind compared to other countries? Question mark, I think, on that one as well. we have to respond. But I think go into one of the things that I suppose concerns me a little bit regarding, I suppose, the hype, is that it does frighten people as well. You know, we've got, you know, within the college, I'm sure universities experiencing relatively aging workforce. That aging workforce is going to be quite worried about some of the things that we're talking about here today and in an event like this. So we have to certainly be measured in our approach to it. And I think lifelong learning is a very, very good phrase to use, because that's something we really, really consider. It's not just for now. This is a lifelong learning process. And obviously, you know, hopefully in the next few years, when government has calmed down with what they're doing at the moment, they will have a sort of a focus on this as well.
Great, thanks all. Okay, so fairly clear consensus among the panel that there is some promise of these fourth industrial revolution technologies. But if they're really going to be successful, they will have to address the major strategic challenges we're facing. So Rachel, as Universities Editor for The Guardian, you have a good overview of the sector. What do you think is the major challenge the sector's facing?
Well, I think it's obviously tempting to answer with the big issue that's affecting all sectors, all industries, all people, which is obviously Brexit. But for the purposes of this conference, I think it's worth looking at a different challenge, which, you know, I think is equally pressing for universities, and that is about how universities are going to prepare graduates for a changing world of work. And as we've already mentioned, I think in a lot of these discussions, some of this stuff is overhyped and maybe some of these changes are overstated. But at the same time, you know, I think there's so many reports kind of evidencing the fact that certain jobs are going to become obsolete, you know, as they're increasingly automated. That different, you know, technologies are changing so fast that people will need to keep up with different skills throughout their lifetime. And it's already been mentioned, this sort of lifelong learning element, and, you know, how universities adapt to that, you know. And then there's a big question about whether universities are teaching the right skills to their graduates. Are they keeping up with the pace of industry? And are they at the forefront of all these, you know, really exciting kind of emerging deep tech disciplines like AI or big data or robotics? We actually recently hosted a roundtable in Birmingham on this very topic, and I found some of the discussion really interesting. I think there was real agreement among all the panelists that we had there, that sort of those very human attributes of flexibility, creativity, empathy are going to be increasingly crucial, since they're the skills that can't be programmed, and it's going to be really important that universities, you know, focus on how to teach those as best possible. But what was quite interesting as well is that several of our panelists, you know, who came from sort of various different universities and organisations, they sort of really criticised what they saw as the government's focus on shortening degree courses, you know, the new accelerated 2-year degree courses that are coming out, with the idea being that these will get graduates work ready faster. And in fact, we had one pro-VC from Birmingham University who said instead we should be talking about slow learning, and possibly the idea that university degree courses should maybe even take 7 years, and that might be interspersed with work experience, and you do sort of bite-sized chunks, and you kind of update your skills here and there, and that would, you know, be a better fit for the way in which our workforce is changing. So, you know, I think, you know, as we've said, all this talk about kind of automation and kind of graduate skills mismatches sometimes might seem a bit intimidating for universities, but I think at the same time there's a really exciting opportunity to really reimagine the curriculum here.
That's really interesting. One of the most compelling visions I saw in this area, Stanford produced a series of 2025 visions. They produced them a while ago. 2025 is not that far away now, I suppose. But one of their visions was this idea of loop learning, where people loop backwards and forwards in education and the world of work throughout their life. So that seems to be along the similar lines. Yeah. Gwyneth, from a student perspective, what worries you the most about education?
Yeah, I agree. It was difficult to pick kind of one thing at the moment. So for me, I've just kind of got the headlines, which is like access to education, funding becoming out of control. We're seeing an increasing trend towards marketization of education, and that's really concerning. I agree with what Rachel was saying. I think it's really important that it's like lifelong learning, and particularly the Welsh Government has a commitment to ensuring that we really promote lifelong learning, and our citizens all get a different chance to engage with education, whichever way kind of suits them. But I'm really worried about kind of the rhetoric around education and let's speed people through degrees, and that doesn't really suit anyone. I'm worried about the lack of diversity in the curriculum, the safety on campus, the future picture of mental health support for students. I'm worried about the austerity of Brexit and the Augar education review and kind of the impact that that's going to have. We've worked over the last few years in Wales on a new funding system, which is, I think, one of the most progressive in the UK and definitely around Europe. And the impact of if Westminster comes out with kind of a new funding review that's going to really impact how stuff works in England, that's going to have a huge effect on how things work in Wales. And so that's concerning as well. And I'm just, overall, the employability of students, but also the push to be that be the only reason that you go to university is also concerning. So I think that balance, I agree, that balance is so important, of this is a chance for people to like explore and engage. And I think the real thing here is to like listen to what people actually, why people actually go to university, what they actually want to get out of it, and the benefits of that. Because if we talk and keep having conversations like this, it's going to lead to a lot better outcomes. But yeah, there are some deep concerns at the moment.
Quite a few, yeah. It's a big to-do list for education. Yeah. Okay, so that gives us a good overview of the challenges we're facing as a sector. Does anyone in the audience want to make a point or raise a question at this point?
Can I just add something to what Gillian said? I think with students' worries about education is, I think, with the media, a lot of things whipped up about education. Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it, am I doing the right course? And I think that's a lot of stress and worry about a student is am I doing the right thing to develop the skills I need for my future? So I know we've talked a lot about colleges and universities here at the moment, but, an element of this could be a student looking at doing some form of work-based learning or apprenticeship program. Okay, is that the right source for me? Should I be doing that? Should I be doing a degree apprenticeship? Should I do the higher apprenticeship? And I think that's one thing we as institutions need to be providing the right, and I would say unbiased advice for learners to make the correct decision on their future. And learners are worried. They're worried about cost, cost elements, whether it's, time cost, whether it's actually a financial cost. And I think one thing that's coming through stronger and stronger, am I going to get the support that's required for me to get through this course? And I think a lot of decisions now with learners is go into the right institution or the right offer of learning, whether that be online learning, that will give them the actual support to get through that course. And I think that causes, some big decision-making for learners and obviously stakeholders to decide what is the best learning for me to get the skills for my future.
Great. Just picking up on that, there's quite a few questions come through on me too already. Some of these I think will fit later into the discussion, so I'll pick them up then. But I think one particular one I'd like to pick up now is, I've lost it amongst all the hamster-related content. So it was about values. Where are we? We've heard a lot about the skills required moving into the fourth digital age. I think, Nick, you were talking about that a fair bit. But what about the values, and how do we engender the values which allow us to prosper?
Engender the values. Is that digital values we're particularly talking about here, or is it just general values?
I think it would probably be a bit of both, speaking for the person who asked the question.
Yeah. I think the fourth generation, it depends what values we want to create. And then I've just talked about support, an element of support and students' well-being. If we want to create a value of an inclusive society, the digital age provides opportunities for it to become more inclusive because it suits some students, some learners, or it can be the other way as well. So I think we have to be very, very careful on what we offer in terms of digital. We're talking AI, we're talking robotics and so on. We have to be very, very careful because those could undermine some of probably the values that we all believe in if we're educationalists. And I think we have to tread carefully. And as I said, I just talked earlier on about values in terms of supporting our staff, and our resources, which are key to all this. Certainly for institutions like college and university, the staff are key to this. And a value of looking after them and making sure they are confident in the approach we're taking is vital, in my opinion.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, can I pick up on the value and so on? I think it's something that strikes me about the fourth industrial revolution is that the educational institutions, perhaps particularly universities, it's not something we need to sit there and let happen to us, that we need to use particularly where we have expertise and knowledge to, link into both local business and economy discussions about what this looks like and are we all going to sit by and let, whatever this role is become redundant, or is there actually something that we could recommend instead as a way of planning around that and using people, recognising attributes and holding on to skills that we suspect will actually be needed into the long term, and not let things go completely out now. And a lot of places, I think, have institutes with expertise in that, and it's kind of making that play out across the sector and across an institution and the businesses it works with to be meaningful. I think another thing, and was mentioned this morning in the Nesta talk, was around the importance of interdisciplinary work and using those values about recognising the value of perspectives brought by other disciplines, being able to use perspectives from other disciplines to address the big challenges that the world is facing. So I think there's a renewed interest in that, certainly in the university sector.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. So a lot of this is in our hands, I think, to summarise some of the both content, that we need to be driving this as much as receiving it.
Well, even if it isn't, I think everyone would feel better if we act like it is.
Yeah, okay. Okay, well, moving on to discussing the emerging technologies. We've heard an insight into the challenges we're facing, but do any of the fourth industrial revolution technologies really offer promise or offer real cause for optimism? So, Sarah, going to you first, which of these technologies for you, the fourth industrial revolution ones, really offer a cause for optimism for the future of education?
I don't know, for some reason, optimism and technology don't get together in my head, but potential, I don't know why. I don't know what the nuance is that I'm picking up on there, really. I think the trick for institutions is picking, and I don't think it will be the same technologies for everywhere. It depends what you're trying to do, which ones fit with your context, your learners, where you are now and where you're trying to get to. So to pick out those which really offer benefit and for which are a distraction. That requires a digital vision, and this is the kind of challenge I'm facing at the moment. I need to bring people together around a digital vision at the same time as that is inevitably determined in part by what is possible. What is possible constantly changes. You're not going to find out what it offers you unless you try some of it. So there needs to be, I think, a sort of iterative interaction between a vision and the technologies you have now, at the same time as maintaining a really good experience for everybody you've already got on your campus. And that's really challenging. When some of these things involve new builds or refits, that's very hard to maintain a good experience now and build for a good experience in the future and do everything in a sustainable way. So with all that caveat, I think key interest to me at the moment are things around Internet of Things, although that's also, in some sections at Bristol, is a byword for distractions, like no talking toasters here. So, I think data analytics, where that doesn't have to mean really big and fancy data analytics. There's still a lot that needs to be done, and a lot of potential that can be just around, cleaning your data, having a clear source of truth. Making sure that everybody's working from the same data and that agrees what it means as well, and that it does mean what people think it means. Managing the data estate, I think this idea of data estate is important, is difficult, and particularly for highly decentralised organisations. And then as soon as you see something like, you want to build a new smart campus, that data estate layer becomes incredibly important and difficult and contested as well. And then you get into all sorts of discussions about what your current data estate looks like, which might be a long way from where you might want it to be. And I think, yes, planning, working out how you can use all of those to support the student journey, having this real idea of journeys and experiences and real people on the end of it. And which sometimes terms like Internet of Things and data estate can get quite far away from, bringing those two things together.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the data estates I think is really interesting. I was a member of the Horizon group. I was talking to them about this, and they said that they believe to get full control of their data estate, they'd essentially have to shut down their university and start again. So it really is a non-trivial problem.
And that's exactly those, Bristol has got a big project around sorting out some of its data, and there is the feeling that if we just stopped and started again, it would be easier. And trying to fix it while it's running is incredibly complex. I mean, I haven't mentioned AI, partly because it gets mentioned all the time.
Doesn't really help, yeah.
I think it will inevitably impact. I think probably first in student information and student support.
Okay.
Not replacing trained counsellors, but are there things that can be done at an earlier stage or to enable you to widen your support to the broadest group of students. But I think we always need to be mindful of the human urge to connect. I don't think that goes away. And be really clear that when we're using technology applications, it is providing additional opportunities, not increasing learners or indeed staff members' sense of isolation.
Yeah, great. Any other panellists want to chime in on cause for optimism on any of the technologies, or pessimism around any of the technologies?
I think it's a really good point making, not to forget the human element to this. However, I think some of it does provide optimism. I think some of it is really exciting. I think it will engage the learners, the future learners and the learners we got now, and I think that's really exciting. But it's just, again, going back to it, it's just doing it in a manner which is in a controlled manner, so it doesn't frighten people off straight away. When you use the term Internet of Things, people go, "Oh, blimey, what's all this about? What's this?" But when you start talking through it and the opportunities there, people do generally, I think, whatever age group, start seeing the possibilities behind it. And I think it's having that discussion, that human interaction, that consultation, and I think, we could be, some of the things that are possible are really exciting.
Yeah, I think the Internet of Things is a good example, because libraries, for example, have been using Internet of Things technologies for years. The RFID tags in books, it's essentially Internet of Things technologies. Sometimes it can seem more daunting than stuff you're actually already doing this stuff. It's just an evolution. I think someone said in one of the questions, why should this always be talked about a revolution instead of an evolution? I think a lot of the technologies are really taking the things you're doing well already and just continuing to improve them. Nick, back to you. One of the technologies we consider in the report is 5G, and Swansea, where your college is based, has been selected as one of the test beds for 5G. What impact do you think this is going to have on education in the area?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Anybody who knows about Swansea, and there's basically the Swansea Bay regional bid. There's bids that have been done in certain areas of the country, and Swansea has got basically 11 potential projects which are occurring part of the Swansea Regional Bay deal. Very exciting. 11 projects. We're actually, I think it's down to 10 now, because we actually lost the barrage, if those of you picked it up in the media during the summer. But all those projects, when you listen to the general underlying theme of all these projects, digital comes through all the time. And a lot of it is based around the fact is that Swansea will be sort of a leading area for 5G. Very exciting, but I think, a huge expectation for providers in the area and education in the area. Because businesses are going, okay, these projects are coming in, we're going to be part of this, whether it's construction, whether it's health, we're going to be involved. So how are you going to, again, provide the skills, and how are you going to provide the workforce for the future? And I think there's going to be a lot of expectation on us to get together as providers, whether, again, I'm talking about the school system, talking about the colleges, post-16, universities, adult and community learning, work-based learning providers, how we are going to work together to provide those skills. And there is no way we can do it all individually. We're going to have to join up, we're going to have to partner, we're going to have to work together and provide those skill sets, okay, for the workforce for the area. The other thing, obviously, is making sure we have the infrastructure to make use of this. Okay, yeah, 5G is coming in, but have we got the infrastructure? Again, we could be off, again, doing bits on our own. Again, it needs to be a part of the region, and I always emphasize the region. There's got to be a huge amount in terms of sharing best practice, and again, I'm going back to, I've mentioned it 2 or 3 times, staff skills. Provide those staff skills, that confidence, so we can, and again, provide those skills for the future, because businesses will be challenging us. They're saying, well, this is coming to the area. How are you as education providers going to meet this challenge?
Very interesting. Okay, going to the Me Too questions. One of the things I wanted to pick up on was that a question about many of these new technologies come at great financial costs. Are we going to end up with a real division between have and have not universities and colleges? And how can Jisc help? Maybe we'll ask the first question first, and I'll say how can Jisc help, perhaps. But are some of these technologies going to create have and have-nots? Are we going to get some universities or colleges that are flying with AI and 5G and Internet of Things, and some which are struggling to adopt these technologies?
I'd say that unless there's an overall national strategy or government strategy, whether that's Welsh, English, Scottish, if there isn't that strategy in place, yes, people will go off and You will have institutions said flying ahead just because for specific reasons they're financially they've got more finances to put into the infrastructure or whatever. There needs to be a national drive on this, a national digital vision, okay, for the area. I said regional. I was just talking about region. It won't work in the region with us unless we all get together as providers. But that's within the region of Swansea. What's happening in other regions across the UK? And that's what I see as vital to this. And otherwise, you will have have-nots. There will be parts of the country who will not have access to this. Certain institutions will have this and that. Yes, creates competition, but is that for the good of the country and good of the regions? I doubt it.
Just say as well, I think especially now during this time where so many new things are coming out, it's quite an exciting time for different institutions, whether those are colleges or universities, to trial out different technologies and see how that works. I know some universities in Wales at the moment are trialing and using out online counselling services, and some of them are finding them really, really useful, and other universities, institutions are looking at that and going, oh, maybe that's something we'll trial out. And actually that's like a huge thing to incorporate into your well-being strategy, but it doesn't cost a lot of money. So it's kind of one of those things where I expect we'll have some institutions try some things out, see how that goes, and as ever, we're sharing best practice with things like that. I think it's kind of easy to adopt as you go and be like, okay, our priorities might be different at this institution, but we're seeing the really good positive impacts having over there, we're going to incorporate that into ours. So I think it's quite a positive thing, just as we're kind of heading into this new direction.
Yeah, I think there's some really good points there. I think for me as well, adoption of technology is not necessarily just about how much money you've got to spend on the technology. It's often about the agility of the organisation, the willingness to change the models, the willingness to try new things. And that's not necessarily the biggest institutions are sometimes find that more difficult.
I think sometimes there's an inverse relationship between the amount of money you've got and your ability to harness new technology and to change. And because the force of necessity is a big driver for these kind of things. And if you look at some of the institutions that are acknowledged as doing interesting work in chatbots, say in the UK, that's not the ones necessarily with the most money at all. So I think there's very, very large institutions that may have more money have other forces acting as brakes on some of the pickup of some of these technologies.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, I would say that's one of the big concerns that I've had from universities, like particularly the sort of larger ones with the bigger bureaucracy to get these kind of new technologies adopted, to have things signed off, and just how difficult that process can be is a real barrier to sort of keeping up with the pace of change in the technological world.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. I've got lots and lots of questions I want to come back to, but I want to make sure we've got enough time to discuss mental health. So what I propose we do is move on to the mental health section of the report, and then we will come back for some of the meatier questions then, because there's some really interesting ones in there. So the second half of the Horizons report really digs deep into the mental health challenges. Any of you who are skimming through the report, this starts on page 37 of the report. It really is an urgent challenge that education is facing at the moment. And it's likely not to be something that's just a near-term challenge. It's something that we're going to have to wrestle with as a society and education for long-term, which is why we picked it as a challenge for the report. So, Rachel, going to you first. So, do you think that education in particular faces a mental health problem, or is this just a reflection of a wider problem in society?
So I think that's an interesting question. Obviously, I think it's clear that it is a big problem in sort of wider society, and there's a lot of sort of stats to support that. And I think universities really are sort of, kind of at the front line of this, because mental health problems often develop, in the teens or early 20s. And it's also pretty widely accepted that young people today have a much kind of, for want of a better word, healthier attitude towards mental health. There's stigma is reducing, there's a lot more information and awareness, and, the idea that it's as important as physical health is sort of really starting to take root. So, universities are full of young people, not only young people, but that means that they're at the vanguard of these societal changes. And then there's the other side of it, and that's the fact that transitions are considered to be particularly problematic for mental health, and school to university is a really, really big one. People are moving away from home and from their sort of childhood support structures. So, it just follows that it would be particularly problematic for universities. What I would say, though, is that I think that maybe the increasing incidence, everyone talks about this IPPR report, which sort of shows a 5-fold increase in the number of students reporting mental health problems. And I think some of that, as I've said, is down to those changing societal attitudes, but I also think that, you know, it does seem sort of plausible to suggest that students today are under more pressure than they've ever been before. You know, there are more of them at university. Universities are expanding really quickly, which means they're not necessarily getting the personal attention that students did previously. They're a far more diverse group from all sorts of different backgrounds, which have all sorts of different needs that might not necessarily be catered to. And then there's also, you know, the spectre of debt that kind of sort of hangs heavily on their shoulders. The, you know, hearing about all the sort of pessimism around the graduate labour market and the fact that employers expect you to get internships and work experience in order to get a job, which wasn't the case, a decade or so ago. And having to juggle all of that, plus maybe term time work alongside your university degree, you know, it all sort of builds up to kind of this picture of a very, very high pressure, like high anxiety environment. You know, and there are other things that I've heard as well, you know, from lecturers who say that the way that the students, the way they've been schooled now, they're so focused on assessment and getting the right grades, and, you know, all they want to do is that's all they're interested in from the moment that they come into their first lecture. They're asking about how they're going to be assessed and what boxes they need to tick in order to achieve that, you know. So, I mean, obviously those are all kind of qualitative things, but I think they do definitely form like this very clear picture of a, I guess, you know, a very, very pressurized environment.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, building straight on that, because of all these pressurised environments, all the difficulties students face, many universities and colleges are reporting a surge in demand for wellbeing support. So Gwyneth, what do you think universities and colleges should be doing to address that surge in demand and the situation as Rachel's described?
Yeah, I agree. I think Rachel outlined it perfectly, like all the different stresses and how that really interacts. And I know the numbers have absolutely massively been surging. So Swansea University, for example, I know from 2011 till now, the numbers of students that have kind of gone seeking counselling support have gone up by over 1,000%, which is a huge number. It's really big, but that's not rare. That's quite common now to see that students are kind of really more willing to come forward and ask for that support. And so I agree. I think it's one of those situations where we have to be really creative in our response to this. So I know here at NUS Wales, we've organised, so I've got a President's Mental Health Working Group, and I have students from every institution in Wales, from colleges right through to university, asking kind of, what do you guys want to see? What do you want institutions to do better and do differently? And I was actually quite surprised. I thought I was going to walk in and they were going to be like, we need more counsellors, and this, and this, and that's what we want, and that's the end of the story. But actually, it was really helpful conversations around things like online services and having like that technology input, and that was something that came up really early on in conversations. Things like the ability to access kind of services bilingually was really important for international students and also for students in Wales, obviously, but I'm trying to speak more broadly about the UK as well. And just things in general, like training for staff as well, that came up as a huge issue really early on, and that was something that I thought was really brilliant to see, that there was a generalized understanding that this isn't just a student issue, this is about everyone who gets engaged with the university and colleges, and this is about all of those kind of students. And the work that we've been doing, we've been working really closely with the regulator in Wales, HEFQ, and the Welsh Government agreed £2 million of extra funding last week for mental health services. So that's brilliant, and I think there's a real desire to like do something different here, but especially when you're talking about universities, it's not necessarily saying, you guys have to fix this whole problem on your own. And I think there's an understanding from students that there's something to say about what is the government doing, and kind of where are those local services and how are they connected to the institutions that students are attending. And then as well, if you talk about college students, kind of they're seeing the increase in funding for universities and kind of what they're getting around mental health. And I often have apprentices ask me, you know, where do I go for my mental health services? Where is that? How can I also access that kind of support? And I think it's really interesting, and it would be really unfair to say, okay, universities, you have this duty of care, you have to just sort this all out on your own, when actually it's a real whole sector approach. And I think from my experience that students are really open to that and are really encouraging conversations around, you know, double registering of GPs. I could go on for hours, but it's a whole sector approach, and I think that's really positive.
Yeah, that fits with a lot of what the UK have been talking about with their whole university approach. It's a complex problem. We need to approach it from a lot of different angles. You mentioned college students there and what's happening. So, Nick, going to you, obviously Gower College, I presume this is a challenge affecting you just as any other college. So what's happening in your college to address this?
Absolutely, it's the increase in mental health issues. It's increasing year in, year out. There's no doubt about that. And I think as a society we have to take some. We have to think about how we challenge learners. I think the expectations on learners, students, in certain terms, is high. Okay, they can't fail. They can't get less than an A. They can't get less than a distinction. They have to go to the best university. Obviously now, the media says, everybody gets a first-class degree and all that sort of thing. The expectations, and I think learners are coming into education, whether that's wherever point that is, I think the expectations are high on them from their parents, from their peers, from their teachers. And I think we have to consider really very, very carefully the transition process. Okay, the transition process from whatever part of learning you're in is crucial. And as colleges, certainly as our college, we're working much, much more on the transition so people are comfortable where they're coming to. They've been maybe with the school for five years, very comfortable with that school, come into the college or come into the college for work-based learning and so on. You've got to get a good transition process in place so they feel comfortable, supported. This is the right institution I'm going to. They are going to look after me while I'm here. I'm going to have the services, whether that's digital services or whether that's, face-to-face services. They know who to contact if there's an issue. I think one thing we were talking about very close recently is data sharing, with ourselves and schools. Sometimes we don't know about the learners and maybe certain elements about them that allow us to prepare better for where they come to the college. But also then it's not just the transition in, it's the transition through. Will they feel they get the support with their courses, with pastoral issues while they're in the college? So you've got to look after that transition through the college. And then also out the other side, all right? And I think some of us probably, that's one area where we sometimes can be weaker on. We don't think, then the expectation, as Gwyneth said about, I've got to potentially go to university, the cost of that, how is that going to be supported? Is the best opportunity for me to look at apprenticeships? And I think it's a transition out. How are we going to work with them to do the right things in terms of applying, whether that's to university, to employers, and providing that support all the way through the process, into the college, through the college, outside the other side. And as a college, we're thinking very much more closely about that. It's very much a cultural change, all right, for education, because I think over a number of years, it's all been about the end product, the result. It's not all about the result. It's about shaping the person and the individual. And if you can do that, I think that can reduce some of the mental health issues. But we're talking a long process here, a long process. And we've all got to engage, we've all got to work together, and we've got to go to share the good practices that are going on in many institutions.
Yeah, this was something that was discussed in depth at the Horizon Group, and one of the predictions made was about transition points, and I think the point was made that we're way off this, but it's an urgent problem. We had a few schools representatives in the Horizons Group, and they were saying that one of the points they worry about for mental health is if someone's been to a lot of different schools. And at the moment, they've got data on that, but then that's not shared with wherever that person's going, be it university or college. So that data isn't passed on, so that local knowledge is then lost in that transition, exactly as you say.
I just want to add a point that we were talking about before we came on about students feeling included in the decision-making process. I think sometimes we don't reflect upon that enough, and I think we've all got to create those communities that learners feel they are part of the process. If they don't feel they're part of the process and they feel things are being done to them, like anybody, that is going to create extra stresses. And I think, for example, we're introducing an NUS representative over the next year. We're going to have our elections and so on, really exciting. And that will give us, the basis to allow them to be really part of how the college shapes itself for the future, which is exciting.
Great. Okay, moving back into the university sphere from colleges. Sarah, your role at Bristol focuses on education innovation. So do you think that teaching approaches need to change in approach to the wellbeing challenge? We've heard about the pressure to get grades, the pressure of assessments. Do we need to change our approach?
I think certainly review, yeah. And assessment is I think that the one that springs to mind first. It certainly comes up first in discussions we're having about it at Bristol. Assessment load, type of assessment, ways assessment are scaffolded and prepared for, and this kind of thing. So our emerging kind of curriculum design framework has well-being as one of the 4 pillars of it. So looking at moving very much towards program level assessment rather than, I think a move to modularisation has been associated with a lot of assessment and not necessarily well-balanced assessment load across the university sector.
So all peaking at once, basically.
Yeah, and I think there's been a move back towards, and some places started this a few years ago with good results of saying, okay, somewhere in this programme we need to make sure that these skills are adequately assessed. Where is that going to be? Don't assess them every module. And also, I think integrative assessments towards the end it helps students develop that sense of mastery that is associated with kind of purpose and that kind of well-being and in a sense of what you've achieved. I think students being seen and acknowledged as a whole person, not a number, is really important in well-being, and sometimes that can be an issue for the curriculum or assessment in ways that you don't expect, like the big move towards anonymised marking in higher education for good reasons, to reduce bias, to make sure that every student every piece of assessment is viewed on its merit, makes it very hard to reflect back to the student. It's things like, oh wow, well done, the way you've presented these ideas has really developed through this year, and so that it reduces the student's sense of their own progress, or they have to do that work for themselves, which can be hard. I think also there's opportunities around thinking about how the curriculum reflects what learning looks like, what scholarship looks like, moving away from kind of lone scholar, working away on some of the behaviour to, again, focus on the importance of working in groups, to drive working in groups, to drive tasks that build cohort engagement. Again, engagement is a strong kind of protector against well-being issues. And as Nick was saying, that the thing about student partnership, but within curriculum development as well, to give them that sense of agency.
Great. Okay, so then final question for the panel before we move to some more audience questions. We've heard a lot of suggestions of things we need to address, so let's give you for a second almighty power over an institution. What one thing would you prioritise to address the mental health challenge? So Gwyneth, starting with you.
That's a big question. I think what's really important is so in the Horizons report, there's this quote from Phil, I believe, and I think it's really, it's such a good quote where it says, the reason that technologies are so important in getting involved is it's streamlining that human interaction. And I think that is so important and something we can't get away from. Is like, I don't want to spend 3 hours trying to kind of, like I did as a student, trying to get through to student finance, standing outside the door, waiting to speak to someone behind a glass window. I can have that conversation online. I can sort that out on their website. That's fine. But I do want to be able to speak to someone if maybe I'm struggling with my coursework, that kind of thing. Like, these technologies are there just to streamline that process. And I think that's so important. And I think it's amazing that it's highlighted in the report. And I think that for me is allow all these technologies, welcome, train them, help it shape institutions, but also make sure that you're remembering that human connection. I know that doesn't really answer your question.
That's a good overall design principle. Let's put it that way.
But I gave it a go.
Yeah. Sarah.
I'd picked out the same couple of things, actually. That smart use of data to make sure you're doing the best with what you've got with large student numbers. I think issues, like I say, it's around the curriculum and being clear about what everyone is expecting of your students. What are we trying to do here, and making sure that is fits with well-being principles and doesn't contain some challenges around, because obviously there is also the drive towards rigour and stretch, and you have to be able to acknowledge both that and well-being. I think some of the predictions in the Horizons report, I think, could go either way. There are things like maximum flexibility. I don't think maximum flexibility is associated with maximum mental ease. If you look at, some of the neuroscience research around decision making, actually has a really high cognitive load, and the more stress people get, the worse they get at decision making. So I think there is recognising the importance of good signposting and people helping students navigate the journey is really important, and also being aware of this tension between the use of data and avoiding as far as is possible, increasing feelings of stress through monitoring, I think is a really big challenge.
Yeah, great, thanks. Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's picking up the same sort of points, but I suppose, I can definitely see the potential for this idea of the kind of learning analytics system that sort of identifies struggling students, both from a kind of how they're doing on their course perspective, as well as how they're doing from a mental health and well-being perspective. But with the enormous caveat that has to be done so sensitively and so responsibly, and really just as that kind of initial point of contact, so it sort of just flags someone up to have someone to talk to, just so that they know that someone is there and someone cares about how they're doing, and that they don't have to sort of, if they're in a low place, try and sort of figure all that stuff by themselves. But definitely always to be very mindful of the fact that actually any type of monitoring exercise can be really, really stressful and really, really problematic. And, if it becomes too sort of onerous, then students aren't going to opt into it. So it just really, really has to be done so sensitively.
Great. Nick?
I talked about transition quite a lot earlier on, so I won't mention that. What I will mention is another part of it, which is what I would describe as the person-centered approach, very much personalized. And I think, again, as institutions, we have to, I think one of these challenges, technology will be great for some learners, it'll be fantastic, it'll work for them as a person, as an individual. And I think there is going to be an expectation that we will become more person-centered. And I'll just give you an example. As in Wales at the moment, we're going through quite a big consultation period in terms of additional learning needs. We, as providers of education, have to really seriously consider every individual learner that comes to us. And if they've got additional learning need, we need to respond to it in the most appropriate manner. In my view, I've been around many of the talks regarding this about how that, that could cost more money, and it's not about that to me. It's a cultural shift. It's a way of thinking differently, and I think that is a great, it's a great driver for change, and it could be reflected throughout the whole educational system, and much more. And we use the term that's in there is person-centered planning, and if we can start looking at the individual, what they require, what they need, whether that's a digital support in some respect, great. But again, that needs, will require the institution, the resources of that institution to change and evolve to support the learners.
Great, thanks. For a lot of consensus there. So that's, we're going now to some of the questions been posted on Me Too. But if anyone wants to ask a question live, using the old-fashioned methods of moving hair with your vocal cords, stick your hands up and we'll get a roving mic to you. But if no one wants to stick their hand up, we'll go straight to the Me Too questions. So starting, first of all, so could the game changer for Education 4.0 be finally true partnership between universities and industry? Anyone want to say anything about that?
We've discussed it a couple of times, this. Yeah, it is a game changer for me. I said I go up to employers, I ask them for questions, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Are we producing the learners that you require? And if they're saying no, we've got a problem. Because ultimately all of us, majority of advisors will have some element of government funding or, and so on. And we've got to respond to that. We've got to respond and produce that workforce for the future. So I think, yes, it could be the game changer where we do, makes us think about, how about we need to be engaging with industry more. And I said the changes with some elements of industry at the moment from 2 or 3 years ago, what's expected, what's in their spec for their employees is quite amazing. And I think it makes us think we have to change, we have to respond to what's needed in the workforce.
Yeah, I think there's a risk here too, isn't it? Because we're seeing now some of the really big tech organisations preferring to recruit some of their employees from boot camp education. So coding boot camps, data science boot camps, these are very big in America. There are quite a few in London now and around the UK, about 50 or 60 in the UK. And these are short courses that people go on, they pay for them, they pay a few £1,000s, they go on this short course, they get their money back if they don't complete, and they get a 98% employment rate. And I think if there is a skills gap for some of the industry, they may well choose to go that route rather than traditional education.
Absolutely. I think I've seen a few questions going up there about online learning quite considerably. Well, it's going to be a choice, isn't it? Learners are going to look for that choice. If it's quicker, potentially better for me, and I'm going to get those skills I need for an industry, well, why wouldn't you? Yeah.
I think particularly in really fast-changing skills market, there's some data from LinkedIn around what technical skills employers were looking. I think it's from the Toronto area, but over a 3-year period, the broad headings are the same, but the actual skills that are showing up in job adverts are changing so fast. You say, how can an educational organisation, which with the best in the world takes a little longer to do curriculum change, that maybe that's not, is that where they need to seek to compete? Or maybe there's some very fast-changing things where it is. It's, you know, that's a niche market for other players, and if you accept that, then you come back to those more underpinning skills around all the soft skills that employers always want in a digital context. And I think, and again, looking at those elements of, you know, foundational data science principles being seen across the curriculums, and this thing about partnership with industry, yes, but across disciplines, whereas I think people probably first think of it to do with the more science and technology disciplines, but actually it needs to apply to everything.
That's interesting. That echoes some of the feedback. I spoke to someone who'd employed quite a few people from a boot camp recently, and they were saying that they felt they get a very different type of person from a boot camp than they did from a computer science course. The computer science person generally had skills which meant they could adopt various different roles in the organisation, whereas the coding boot camp people were very specific and could adopt a very specific role and do it very quickly, but wouldn't necessarily be able to apply their skills to such a wider range of issues. So I think that's...
Yeah, and so I've had some interesting discussions recently around, okay, if you were designing an online, quite highly disaggregated master's level potentially, but only if you put them all together it would be a master's. You know, how would you do that in ways that would make sense to learners and make sense to employers, and what would the flow be? And we were discussing, like, if you had foundational computer science, where would you put that in the kind of order in which you were encouraging people to do it?
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked a few times about lifelong learning. So one of the questions in the audience is, do we think that new technology will improve people's ability to study at a distance of lifelong learning? So do these technologies make that mode of study more viable? So Gwyneth, starting with you.
I hope so. I think the more improvement we can make there, the better. So, but I think ultimately, really, it comes down to like funding people being able to do that. With the Diamond Review in Wales, sorry to talk about Wales again, but we're doing so great. With that funding review there, we've got funding for part-time students on the same par as full-time students, and so the Open University in Wales has seen their numbers at the last count increase by 49% of people doing part-time study, and that's, I mean, probably directly linked to the fact that they have that funding to do that. So I think that ability to do that is really great, and then the more we increase on kind of the technology around supporting people to actually do that properly and to enjoy it and not to be a really frustrating process, the better. Like, that's absolutely fantastic, and that really increases the ability to do lifelong learning, and I'm very supportive of that, and to be able to just kind of, you know, pick up and just do a module here and there, like, that's absolutely brilliant, and we should really be encouraging more technology to support that, definitely.
Great, and then to pick up on another question on this topic, so, okay, we'll come to you, Zach. So just to follow up on that one, we've got someone asking, lifelong learning is a great opportunity, technology is a great opportunity here, but are universities and colleges really culturally agile enough to seize this opportunity? So Gwyneth, putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I think we're ready. I'm encouraging them to be. I'm obviously not an institution, but I definitely, in all the conversations we're having, universities are like excited about the challenge, colleges are excited about the challenge, and it's a new time. You have to keep up, like that. It's do or die, really. Do or die. Okay. We've got a question from the audience.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I'm Chris. I'm from the University of Leeds. Just about the adoption of new technology with those well-accepted models that we're familiar with, and just having the shiny new tech isn't enough. We know that there's facilitating conditions, and a big thing that's coming through from the meeting and other things is staff training, staff time, staff development. So is it time that we start collaborating between institutions, from schools to FE to HE, to equip the skills gap that exists for staff, not just for students? And what does the panel think?
Really interesting. Who wants to take that?
I think I mentioned it before. I think it's the most crucial part of this. I think you've got to have leadership within an institution to drive things forward. You know, it's all right, as you said, we can have all these technologies, but if we're not investing in the staff, to me, which is the most crucial resource, we are going to struggle. There's no doubt about it. I said we're just discussing a new digital vision within our college at the moment. We talked to the learners, and one of the things the learners said straight away to us, will the staff have the skills to support me? That was the first thing. How are you going to invest in it? Institutions have to invest, there's no doubt about it, and I think it's a very good point about partnership. in the sector, and I'm going to mention Wales again, I may as well. And I suppose Wales and the region that we're in, at the moment, there are different, I would say, visions or strategies for primary, for secondary, for post-16, and then university. All different digital strategies. That's madness. So how are we going to link those up, work together, develop our resources, develop our staff, and provide the best for our learners? We've got to think partnership. We've got to think investment in our staff. Otherwise, all the stuff we're talking about today, it won't sort of take off at all.
Great, thanks. So just to finish, there's been a question about what's the relationship between the Jisc Horizons report, the Horizons Group report, and the EDUCAURS, long-running EDUCAURS Horizons report. We like the EDUCAURS Horizons report, it's very useful. We felt there was room for more than one of them. And ours is slightly different, so we use the same name because it's a good name. So there's no conspiracy or anything like that, it's just we believe they're complementary reports.
Can I ask you one thing?
Oh, yeah.
So for you...
For me personally?
For you as Jisc.
Oh, you as... Oh, me as
What's
okay.
your big take-home from the report?
That's a really good question. We prepared most of the questions, but obviously this one isn't. This was sprung on me.
I did send it in.
So I think from the mental health point of view, I think there's two things. There's the promise of data, but the incredibly careful use of data in this area. And the second thing is the person-centred approach, and the use of well-being is essentially the design principle in the way you approach all aspects of education. I think those, for me, were the two big takeaways. We're going to do some work on around the data trust, because I think that's a promise. The data for well-being analytics, because I think that's promising. But those are the two. So thanks very much to the panel. Really interesting to hear from you. Thank you for coming in and giving your perspectives. The next Horizons group is meeting in June, and we're looking for new topics for them to discuss, following on from the mental health one. People seem very keen on hamsters and lions, so perhaps that's a topic for a future report. But if any of you have any suggestions, please get in touch with me or via the email address innovation@jisc.ac.uk. One of my colleagues is going to be doing Vox Pop interviews outside of the who's given me a signal there so I don't forget, interviews about this session, about the topics we've discussed outside the hall. So if you're interested in being interviewed, exit through that door and you'll be collared to give your opinions on camera. But thank you very much for coming to the session today. Hopefully it's been some use. I'm sure we'll all be on the panel, be around at lunch, so feel free to collar us and talk about any of this further. Thank you very much.
Thank you.